Hi, I'm Felicia Anderson, Director of Archives and History. The Baldwin County Commission feels it is important to honor and recognize the incredible heritage that we are a part of. Heritage is important in understanding the story of Baldwin County, its history, identity, and in understanding our people. The title of this documentary is Baldwin County Heritage Families and consists of 4 segments using snippets of videos that provide an overview of the history of families that lived here more than 100 years ago. Now for part 1 of this 4-part series, The First Settlers.
The first Europeans to come to our area were the Spanish and the French. Bienville was said to have stayed in Bon Secour before founding Mobile, and it was also reported that he had a fishing and a hunting camp in Bon Secour for the soldiers from Fort Conde in Mobile. Bienville had an excellent relationship with the Native Americans in Baldwin County. He had his body tattooed in the local tribal fashion, snakes from head to toe. Of course, the Native Americans who hunted, fished, and farmed in this area were abundant. By the time the white settlers began moving in, the primary culture was Choctaw or Creek.
My name is Hamilton Cole Weatherford Jr. and they call me Ham.
My name is Kenneth Charles Weatherford, Kenny for short, and this is my brother.
My name is Jonathan David Weatherford, but my family and friends call me John David.
What part of the Creek Indians? Descendants of William Weatherford, Red Eagle. He is our great-great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Our fathers are Jonathan Matthew Weatherford and Hamilton Cole Weatherford. My dad works at Baldwin EMC, and his co-workers gave him the nickname Eagle. Hamp's dad works at Standard Furniture, and he graduated from the University of Alabama, just like his father. There are 6 siblings, 3 girls and 3 boys. It's a big group, and we all have our monthly family dinner.
Their fathers, our grandfathers, Charles David Weatherford Sr. I have his middle name, and my brother Kenny is named after him too. He was served in the U.S. Navy and fought in the Korean War. He worked for the University of Alabama.
My great-grandfather was Arthur Cole. I have his middle name just like my father. He had 9 siblings. He worked at Newport and Bay Minette and was a great farmer, and everyone knew him for his farming ability. He shared his crops with everybody, and my dad said that his sugarcane and watermelon was the best around.
Our great-great-grandfather was Sherman Evans Weatherford. Our house is built about 1,000 feet away from the old Weatherford home place. Bricks and the old well can still be seen. The Weatherfords have lived on the same land since 1925.
Our great-great-great-grandfather, Captain Charles A. Weatherford, he served in the 15th Alabama Cavalry Regiment during the Civil War.
Our great-great-great-great-grandfather is Charles Weatherford Sr. He died at 96 and was known to be the oldest man in Monroe County. You could fill a book with all the stuff that he went through and witnessed as the son of William Weatherford, Red Eagle.
Our great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was William Weatherford, also known as Red Eagle. He was the son of Charles and Sohoy III, who was princess of the Wind Clan, the ruling clan of the Creek Indians.
He was also a plantation owner. He raised the finest horses. He was an honest and trustworthy man, and he was well liked by all. He was also bold, gifted, and eloquent. William was a born leader of all men.
In 1813, there was a war against the settlers and the Indians. The Indians wanted to hold a tally to see who would want to fight the settlers, so they had red sticks and white sticks. The red sticks were the Indians that wanted war, and the white sticks were the ones that didn't. Now, William Weatherford, Red Eagle, he had family on both sides, so he really didn't want to fight, but whenever the tally system was in favor of the red sticks, he had to fight against the settlers. But the Indians were really riled up about this because the Indians went to Florida to get guns and supplies, and on the way back at Burnt Corn Creek, they were attacked by a group of settlers.
In retaliation, on August 30th, 1813, Red Eagle and his tribe attacked Fort Mims. The massacre of women and children went against Red Eagle's direct order, and as he was unable to stop his soldiers, he rode away. And people said he was a savage since at the battle he let women and children be massacred, but history will show that he was not, and he just did what was best for his people, who were the Creek Indians.
There were more battles in the Creek War. One of them was Battle at Holy Ground. The Red Stick prophets claimed that no white man could enter the Holy Ground and live. But when the soldiers crossed into the Holy Ground, the Red Sticks panicked and fled. Red Eagle tried to rally the warriors, but he could not. So Red Eagle escaped on his horse, Arrow, and jumped off a 15-foot cliff into the river. Creeks could not win the war. To save the Creek women and children from starvation, he surrendered to General Andrew Jackson. The treaty signed half of what is present-day Alabama to the United States, it was owned by the Creek Nation lands before then.
General Andrew Jackson was great friends with Red Eagle after the surrender. General Andrew Jackson thought very fondly of Red Eagle, and he stayed with him for 2 years until he moved back home to his plantation, where he became a very successful farmer and plantation owner.
The earliest community of white settlers came when Baldwin County was still a part of the Mississippi Territory. Many came from the East Coast, which was colonized by the English. These communities were the northernmost part of the county along the Alabama and Tensas rivers and on the Federal Road. It ran from the East Coast all the way to Stockton, the southernmost point in the territorial lines.
I'm Agnes Smith, and I'm a lifelong resident of Baldwin County, and I would like to tell you a little bit about the ancestors who came here in the early days of the formation of Baldwin County. One of my earliest recollections are stories from my mother telling me about the earliest ancestor who came here, James Manuel Earl. He came here from England. He came really to Virginia first, and then moved to Alabama right about the time of 1791. He met and he married a woman named Elizabeth Tarvin, and they established a home site in Blackshear, Alabama, in the northern end of the county. One interesting story that Mother told me about James Manuel Earl is that he realized about 1813-14 that there was potential for an Indian uprising and perhaps danger to his home and his family. So he put Elizabeth in his wagon and he journeyed to the site at Fort Mims. Well, James Manuel Earl was not comfortable with the way the fort looked and the setup, so he asked his wife to get back into the wagon, and he drove her to Blakely, Alabama, to the settlement there. And for that reason, they were spared during the massacre at Fort Mims. Once the county settled down and things were peaceful again, they went back to Blackshear, Alabama, and he rebuilt a home because his home was burned in that Indian uprising. So he rebuilt a home. It was a double pen log cabin. And my mother told me when I was young that at that time it was the oldest structure in Baldwin County. I don't know if that can be verified or not, but it's really very sad to me that it burned some years ago to the ground. It was built of heart pine and cypress. They had really huge cypress stumps that were the foundation of the house, and my husband attempted to sort of level it, and we were going to see if we could keep it in fairly good repair, but it burned, and so we lost their home. Now, he has descendants. There were 3 James Manuel Earls, and then came a John William Earl, and then a Thomas John Earl, my father, and then my brother too. So there were 6 descendants in that line of James Manuel Earl. Another sort of interesting story about him and about the home site is that after the Indian uprising and the massacre at Fort Mims, Andrew Jackson came to the area. And the history books, of course, record his time here. Well, his wife, Rachel, accompanied him and for a 3-month time stayed in this double pen log cabin that I've just told you about that was James Manuel Earl's. Now that would be sort of exciting, except that she wrote home to Nashville and to the Hermitage where they lived that this was a godforsaken place filled with critters, and it was way too hot and she couldn't wait to get home. So it was exciting that she stayed there, but she didn't record her visit as a very pleasant time. Another ancestor that I have who came here most definitely prior to 1920 was Thomas Parsons Atkinson. And he lived in a home that Beth Slaughter lives now in Tensas, Alabama. David English built the home. And then Thomas Parsons Atkinson married his daughter and moved into it. And it's somewhat of an antebellum home. It is in the northern end of Baldwin County and on the east side of Highway 59. It is it could be called in the category of being an antebellum home. It didn't burn, and one of the few homes in the area that was not burned by the Yankees because they set up their headquarters there. Consequently, they let the house remain there. Let's see, there are other ancestors. Nancy and Joseph Boyles are ancestors of mine, and they were among the early settlers here. They came from North Carolina and settled in Baldwin County in the early 1820s. And they were responsible for establishing the church in Little River, and that is recorded in the Little River Baptist Church history. Now, I overlooked this particular point about James Manuel Earl. When he came here in 1791, and then they did have the massacre, of course, at Fort Mims, as I've mentioned, he was one of the signers of the petition asking for Baldwin County to be a part of Alabama instead of Florida. There were 20 men who signed that petition, and that's according to my mother. I'm just relating stories that she passed down to me, but he was one of the 20 signers of that petition so that Baldwin County would be part of the state of Alabama instead of the state of Florida. Now, just to sort of cover the waterfront, if I may, and if you don't mind, I have a notebook that my sister-in-law, Pat Smith Justice, prepared for my husband, Harry Smith, and I found it so interesting. She researched their family, and I'll mention these names to you because my husband has quite a history here in Baldwin County with family names such as Smith, Holmes, Briers, Davis, Goffin, Feast, G, and Mobley. And all of these families settled in Baldwin County prior to 1920. In fact, most of them were in the early 1800s, if not before that time. So I told my husband before I planned to be here with you today that we've been in Baldwin County a very long time. Yes, I grew up in Blackshear, Alabama, and that's near the home place of James Manuel Earl, the first ancestor that came to Baldwin County and lived here, as I mentioned to you earlier, and my memories were extremely happy. I think some of my first memories are about my grandmother's store. It was just right in front of our house. I was named after her. She was Agnes Atkinson Earl, and I was Agnes Atkinson Earl too. And as a little girl, I would sometimes, even in my nightgown, other times in my overalls, go to the store and help her. In fact, she taught me how to make change when I was 4 years old because I was able to sell the ice cream and the Jack's cookies. And then I always enjoyed it when the Candyman came and I looked for him because I would greet him before she could get there. And he, just being partial to little children, would hand me a full bag of Hershey's Kisses. And I would run to the back of the store and sit on the ground and have my way with the Hershey's Kisses until Grandmother found me and would then close the bag and make me come inside and work for her. But although Rachel Jackson may have described the area of North Baldwin County as a howling wilderness filled with critters, those of us who lived there and grew up there remember it as an absolutely beautiful area of the world, which is somewhat semi-tropical, and always in our hearts, it will be home. Living in Blackshear, we were somewhat remote, and the closest place for us to go to school was Stockton Junior High School. It was a 20-mile trip on the school bus, and that would take at least 30 minutes in the morning and again in the afternoon. Then for the high school years, we were transported to Bay Minette, which was an hour's drive or ride on the school bus. But going to Stockton School was so much fun because my grandfather, Isaac Pierce Mason, had been principal of that school for almost 40 years. It was a grades 1 through 9 school, but it had only 8 teachers. Consequently, we had to have a classroom with 2 grades in it every year, and the teachers simply took time taking the responsibility of having the double classroom. But it was a happy school. My grandfather made sure that works of famous artists were hanging on the walls. My mother-in-law, Lois Holmes Smith, used to tell me that she knew as much about special art as anyone in the world because of those pieces of art that my grandfather hung on the walls of the school and because of statues that he had placed around. He also was very musical, and periodically, and really rather often, we would have assemblies in the auditorium of the school, and we had our little music books, and we would sing songs, which was such a special way to start the day. We would sing, and then when we would have announcements, he would play have someone there to play the piano, and it was always just a very happy time for us of youngsters. There were only about 127 students in the school, grades 1 through 9, if everybody were there that day. But if not, then our attendance would be a little lower. But we all knew each other, the teachers knew our families. We had to behave because the word about misbehavior got home before we did, if we didn't. But we became very close, and again, they were very happy days, and indeed we were prepared for higher education learning when we left there.
My name is Martha Earl Smith. I was privileged to have been born and raised in Blackshear, Alabama. I have records that trace the Earls in Blackshear all the way back to James Manuel Earl, who came to Blackshear in 1789. 5 generations followed. James Earl II, James Earl III, John William Earl, Thomas Earl Jr., Thomas Earl Jr. and Sr. My memories of Blackshear are happy. We had a strong family unit. We had a thriving community with our own church in the front lawn, the little church that I'm sitting in right now, the Montpelier Methodist Church, a historical contribution to our county. The little church sat on our front lawn in Blackshear. And I remember as a little girl keeping the church swept out, putting flowers in it, playing hymns for the services that we had. And it was just a rich memory. It was just almost like a little family chapel. We had our own store, country store, and a post office very close to the church. All of my elders represented strength and prosperity to me. Miss Agnes was Miss Agnes Atkinson from Tensile, Alabama. She was my grandmother. She ran the store. She was postmistress. She was educated as a teacher, and she taught everyone that she could get her hands on to teach, including her husband, who only completed the 4th grade, my grandfather. And my grandmother also taught Sunday school. I have her name on the registry early on in the early 1900s in this little church. She was a bride at that time. My daddy was a timber businessman. He was into agriculture, into livestock, and he built a sawmill. He did anything he could to raise this family in Blackshear, Alabama, in such a happy environment. Mother was a loving, smart woman. She was Martha Mason from Stockton, Alabama, and she served the community and her family with love. I witnessed as a child, and get ready for this, early transportation by people by way of horseback, horse and buggy, to come to the country store that my grandmother ran for groceries. We've had an automobile, and I remember well when the Highway 59, was paved. In fact, myself as a child, my cousin Charlie Earl, and my sister Catherine followed the truck as it paved. And my mother had tar babies on hand after we had that little escapade in our life. She scrubbed us with, I'm not sure what, to get the tar off. I remember the first TV in our home. I remember the first telephone. Now that was really a winner for us. Also, I rode the school bus to first Stockton, to grammar school and to junior high school, and then on the school bus to Bay Minette for my education. It seemed to me that everyone knew each other, helped each other out, and cared. And then I left in 1955 to go to college. I met my husband when I was in college. His name is William Calvin Smith, an engineer, and we have had quite a ride in our life, from Blackshear, Baldwin County, to Atlanta, to Cincinnati, Shelby, North Carolina, where we raised our children, 2 beautiful children, a son and a daughter. And then full circle back to Baldwin County in retirement. I have been blessed. My beginning in Blackshear gave me the moral compass to have realized fulfillment and happiness in my life. Montpelier was started in the early 1900s, this church. It was started but completed in the early, and I think I have my records go back to 1902 when they considered this finished. And I also have a list of the people who came to church, their families. And goodness gracious, at that time, as Methodists still do, you had charges, as we called it. Stockton, Latham, Montpelier, and Little River. Those 4 churches which the Methodist pastor would service. And our church was really kind of limited in my childhood and Agnes's to the families that lived there at that time. So many had left or died. We had 3 families of Earls, the Charles Earls, the Thomas Earls, and Mr. Frank Earl, and then Mr. Elmer Bradley and Miss Annie. And those were this is why I call this our little chapel, because you had 4 contributors to it. And we would fill up about 4 pews for service and have an hour service, and no air conditioning, no heat. Therefore, while we were in service, those windows lever. They put a rod down the center to make them stay put. But if it was windy at all, they would rock. And I remember vividly sitting on that front pew with Charlie Earl, my cousin, children, and the window got to rocking. And I thought we were going to be punished for laughing and giggling. And my father told the story of one time his daddy had him pinned in. His daddy sat on the side pew there, and my daddy was over in and couldn't get out the center aisle to get out, and the preacher preached, and he preached, and he preached. And my daddy finally looked up at his daddy and said, "Daddy, I'm hungry. I think I'll go home and get a sandwich and come back." And he crawled under his legs. Just a very informal, loving, rich, beautiful Christian environment that we came up in. And my grandmother was an avid Christian. I slept with her as a child. We lived under her roof. And if I was restless at night, she would teach. The way to get me to go back to sleep would be, okay, let's learn the books of the Bible. Let's learn the Bible. Let's learn the Psalms. And to this day, I'm able to repeat a lot of verses in the Bible. But I had to live to be an older lady, which I am now, to say, hey, look, that's just off the chart, the heritage that we have as children coming up there. In isolation, sort of, yet it was very thriving in all sorts of ways. The house that I grew up in, on the same property with the church in the front, was built by my grandfather, John William Earl. And my grandmother came to the Blackshear community. I have in my records, I'm thinking around 1902, not absolutely certain that's correct. But she is the person that instituted teaching Sunday school, and have the records, and we pull the records from the church, and I have those for posterity's sake of the people who worship there. The home that we grew up in, it was just wonderful to have the intergenerational spirit, which we did have with my grandmother, who was off the chart as a an example for everybody in the community. She was a teacher, she was postmistress, she worked until she was in her 80s, and she passed away at 84 in the little store. My father, there again in the isolation, but timber was the business and the land was the business. And he was very creative and had a lot of energy. And he went from one thing to another to, as I said, agriculture, fields. I remember a red Dutch clover field, just gorgeous crimson clover that was Daddy's. And in that red Dutch clover field, he had a whole herd of white-faced hereford, just beautiful. And then as a child, I would go with him. He started his logging operation on the Alabama River. And I remember going with him on those trips, and they used mules to roll the logs to get them up on the vehicle that would transport them to a body of water, in this case, a river, and then float them down to Mobile. But that was the thriving business in Baldwin County, period. Lumber, timber, agriculture, what else? Livestock, yeah. But we just had an exposure to so much more than a lot of people ever dream of having. Mother would always host the preacher, and she'd have a real wonderful meal when he came to our church, and we would invite him for lunch. But when I was talking about the elements here, when it was too cold, we would move church to our house, and the preacher would preach in the living room, and then we would feed him. Because he was sitting on the front yard, but we didn't have air conditioning or heat. And to accommodate that, but I remember the fans, they were fine. That kept us. And the windows open in the summertime. But if it's cold, we had to sometimes, rarely, move to the house. But I was born and raised in Blackshear, and until I was a teenager, there was no such thing as a telephone. And that's why I say, boy, when we got telephones, that was moving up for communication's sake. And it really was.
My name is Harriet Outlaw. I am a local author, but call myself a folklorist. I love the stories of the families of Baldwin County. We are here today at the Baldwin County Heritage Museum, which is actually the perfect place to have visits with some of these heritage families of our county. These people are descendants of some of our very earliest settlers that came here while this part of Baldwin County, while the southern part of Baldwin County was still under Spanish or French rule. They were given land grants by the kings of those respective countries. In this part of the museum, we have a display that has been created by the Key family of Lillian. Lillian was first settled by the Suarez brothers, who had a Spanish land grant. And today we will visit with some of their descendants.
Hello, my name is Harry Suarez. This is my brother Vicky Suarez, and we're going to tell you about our ancestors, Pedro Suarez and his family on down the tree. Back in 1779, they came over from the Canary Islands, and they settled here at Perdita Beach and Pensacola and Lillian. Their land grants came around the turn of the century and were recorded around 1830. Pedro had several offspring with him, besides his wife, Andrea. Had Anselmo, had Francisco, and Juan. And Andrea had a daughter. And they settled in Pensacola, and Francisco later on got married. He came over to Baldwin County, where they started where they had a family, and later on the family started receiving land grants over here in this area in Baldwin County, and those land grants included Francisco's off of Fort Morgan down to Navy Cove and up toward Gulf Shores, and the kids all received land grants over here on the east and west shore of Perdita Bay. Anselmo was one of the sons. He got Bear Point, 640 acres, as well as the rest of them had 640 acres each. And Joseph was up around Soldiers Creek, around the bay shore, on the east shore, on up to, I would say 640 acres, however far that goes. And Pedro, another son, he received his land grant around Spanish Cove and that area, and that's also the Old Spanish Cemetery was on his property. It was 1 acre that they gave. And on down the line, we had Emmanuel. He received some of the property on his land grant. He got 1,799 acres. So he got all of the remaining eastern shore on Perdita Bay and the western shore on Perdita Bay, which is Escambia County, Florida. We don't know where they're buried. We think they're buried in a Spanish cemetery when they all died off, but there's no headstones indicating that. But there are 18 unmarked graves out there that have never been identified. From there on, some of them had kids and some of them didn't. And Joseph he had 2 wives. So anyway, he had about, I would say, by both wives, he had around 12, 13 kids. And it's impossible to track them. Joseph was our great-great-granddaddy, as Francisco was our great-great-great-granddaddy. And again, Pedro was our great-great-great-great-granddaddy. So when one of Joseph's kids was George Randolph, who was also our great-granddaddy. And he lived over at Perdita Beach on the bay, or on the Palmetto Creek. And there, our grandfather was born and raised, Norman, and his brother Aubrey, and they had Thurmond and a couple more. Anyway, Aubrey and our granddaddy, Norman, they built the hotel over at Perdita Beach back in the 30s, I think it was, and it was quite nice. I remember it. And that's about it. Our dad came around and that was us, and here we are. So,
well, one of our family photographs includes our granddad, Norman Suarez, and his wife, her 2 sisters and mother, Samantha Pedro, who with her husband settled up around Pedro, Alabama back in right about 1898, 1899. They were down on Perdido Bay, well actually at Palmetto Creek, just off of Perdido Bay for a family reunion from part of the family that came down from Chicago. That's originally where the Pedros came from. And so that family's up there, or some of the family members came down to get together here on Palmetto Creek. It's rather interesting to see the dress and the automobiles and the style of that day. I remember that I received this photograph from a woman in St. Louis who I was poking around the internet I made contact with her, and she sent this down, and her mother was still living then, quite elderly, up in her 90s. She said that her mother said that one of the things that she remembered was a highlight of the visit as far as my granddad, Norman Suarez, was concerned, or our granddad, was that he had a brand new still that he was showing off, and he was quite pleased with about that. And that was apparently, in those days, it was customary for everybody to have, perhaps not everybody, but many people to have their own stills, where nowadays we have to go down to the corner pub and welcome our friends. So that photograph was taken in 1926. Well, let me regress a little bit and give you some appreciation of why it's difficult to identify all of these. Back when Francisco, who came over with his mother and dad from the Canary Islands in 1779, I'll get it right in a minute. He lived in Mobile when he was first married, which would have probably put it at about 1820, and at that time there were about 350 families in Mobile, and there were less than that in Pensacola, and a few scattered between the two areas. But so everybody pretty well knew everyone else. All the families were on a first name basis, both cities. Ultimately they became kin to each other. And so if you follow the family tree down through today, the Suarezes are kin to just about everybody in the Baldwin County area that's been here, say, for the last 50 to 100 years. So it's difficult to account for all of them. A couple of interesting stories. Harry mentioned that Francisco had 4 sons and 2 daughters. The sons were the ones that received the bulk of the land grants, and there was a couple of interesting stories. One of them, Pedro, was it Pedro, that was considered to be probably a pirate? Emmanuel, excuse me. And he had a couple of land grants, and he never really had a home and hadn't married, and he moved around Perdita Bay and so forth, and disappeared somewheres in close to his 80th birthday. And there's one claim that they never found his body. There's another family story that's been floating around most of my life, that he was so ornery that when he died, the family members buried him upside down. I don't know if that's true, but it's sort of an amusing story at any rate. So there's several of those. I could go on, but that kind of gives you a flavor for what was going on in those days. My dad did not tell me a lot about his early days living at Perdita Beach, but I remember one story. I was grown, married. He must have been 80 years old at the time when we were driving down Highway 97 down towards the beach down there, and as we passed the old Hayes house on the right, which is a house that was originally built by our great-grandfather, George Randolph. He said that when we were living down here, I was about 16 years old. He said my granddad, George Randolph, died, and he said, I can remember holding the bucket that had the embalming fluid in it, where they had him stretched out on the dining room table, embalming him. And and I guess that was the way of life back in, that would have been about 1928.
Well, they came from the Canary Islands, and they stopped off in Cuba. The ship stopped off there because of uprisings along the Gulf Coast, around Pensacola and Biloxi and in that area. And they were, the governor of Cuba at the time was afraid that if they went into that area, they might get their ship blown out of the water by the British. They were patrolling that area, and they were taking every boat out they could. And so they stayed in Cuba for about 5 or 6 months, we think. And as far as we know, all of them came on over when the ship was released. Now, we don't know if our ancestors came over in a different ship from Cuba and went straight to Pensacola, or whether they actually went into New Orleans to the port there and dispersed and went. There were probably, 2,000 people total that they brought over from the Canary Islands on 8 different ships. And the ship that ours came over on was the last ship. And that's why they were held over in Cuba, because that was right about the time the British started trying to take control of everything.
Let me add to that a little bit. That all of that is I agree with, but as I came along, as I grew up, as all of us grew up in this area, we had an uncle, Dolph Suarez, who was sort of the family historian, and the story that he told us all my life, all his life, until he died, was that the 3 Suarez brothers came over to Florida, down south of here, down around Fort Myers and what have you, and they around the 1500s or 1550, and then they migrated up this way, and they brought cattle and what have you with them. And when I began to research this a few years ago, I looked for historical documents that supported that, and I wasn't able to find any. The earliest I found, the Suarezes, our line, that came over here, sailed over from the Canary Islands in 1779. They're on the ship Manifesta. They showed up again in the, there's a census, there's a 1784 Spanish census of Pensacola, where they're listed as residents. Pedro and his son, 2 sons and a daughter, and his wife, and then we begin to see where his name appeared on land purchased in both Pensacola and in Mobile. Now, these were lots, home sites, and but prior to that shipment leaving the Canary Islands, and there's several articles over the years I've read several where it gives different accounts, but have not been able to substantiate any of those.
Baldwin County really is a great place to live. Baldwin County is a place where people work to keep it the land of milk and honey. In Baldwin County, it's the home to newcomers and natives alike. Baldwin County is where we treasure our past and plan for our futures. We as a community share the responsibility to identify and preserve our history for future generations so that they will know what came before them. It is our hope that through this documentary, you reach out to others in your families to discover your heritage as well. Thank you for watching.